Hello everyone and welcome to yet another day in this The Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And even as things are looking better, in fact they are mostly just staying the same, I am afraid to say. And they will stay the same, or get worse even, under this government. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail on it, but the grooming inquiry isn't the only bit of major news that has happened this week, and it's only Wednesday. Obviously, the whole decriminalising abortion up till birth has even got some of the most ardent abortion defenders I know effectively sick to their stomach. But this isn't about that total catastrophe. We're talking about another much longer term total catastrophe, that is the grooming gang scandal. And obviously the Casey report, which was just the most recent report on the grooming gang scandal, was released this week, and well, I'll let Baroness Casey herself say what she recommends.
I was with many people at the beginning of this. I thought to myself, we've had one massive national inquiry, it took years, it was very good, and the job was to getting on with implementing the recommendations.
So what Baroness Casey is talking about there is the J report, which did focus on the overall issue with child sexual abuse in England and Wales, which is fine and good to investigate, obviously. However, this Casey report was a lot more focused on the type of grooming gangs that have ethnicity as one of their main motivators for their sexual abuse. And I will do another video going through specific findings of the reports. That is not particularly what this video is about. This one is much more about the discussions and the reaction around this report. But it did find that there was an overwhelming problem with Pakistani men when it came to these grooming gangs. And that's pretty much acceptable even in the mainstream to say these days. But yes, Casey originally didn't recommend a national report because of this J report. But as time went on and she dug further into her own report, well, yes, her mind did indeed change.
And actually, sort of joking aside, as it were, I also thought, do we really need to spend a great deal of money that we probably don't have on something like more lawyers' fees, really? But then during the course of the last 3 or 4 months, it became absolutely clear to me. I think I've surprised people actually in Downing Street and beyond in some ways, that the reluctance of local areas to face up to the facts that they didn't treat victims well enough, that they haven't accepted that they have failings. And so from things like the announcement of the 5 local reviews, only Oldham Council came forward and said, yes, we better get on and do one. Nobody else did.
Yeah, this was a bit of a backtrack that Jess Phillips announced in that infamous clip where Katie Lamb got up and started reading out the court notes of the heinous crimes committed within Oxford by, once again, one of these grooming gangs. And even on that subject, the Ivory Tower class are just completely head in the sand still on this issue. So Matt Goodwin tweeted an example of how lost the expert class is on the rape gangs. When I gave a talk at Oxford and mentioned them, I was shouted down, and one professor cited dodgy Home Office study to the claim that they are mainly white, and this for the other video, but there's an entire section in the report just called Denial, and that Home Office report is part of the denial, because effectively the report literally says this report that it's mainly white men in these grooming gangs is based on no evidence whatsoever. It's just a lie, and it's still repeated. But the most interesting part is this last sentence. They didn't even know there was a big rape gang that was in Oxford. Completely unaware of what's even going on in their local community, let alone nationally. This is one of the biggest scandals, possibly the biggest, that Britain has ever faced. And there are still people in these lovely sandstone walls of Oxford who are happily denying it, despite the fact that the expert class is now, noticing that maybe people like Tommy Robinson were right. And I'm talking about his work years ago. He's kind of fallen off.
So there's a reluctance there. Then I looked at they're called quality assurance reviews that were done in Greater Manchester under Andy Burnham, Mayor Andy Burnham up there, and realised again that people were fighting over whether they could share data. They made the reviewer's life a complete misery, and eventually they abandoned doing the last piece of work because they couldn't get people to cooperate with it. So
just to translate that and read between the lines for you, Casey is effectively saying there are people who are still trying to cover this up, so quite clearly we haven't quite found everything. Usually I get a bit iffy of the phrase, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, but when it comes to this case, I have absolutely no time for anyone who tries to fight against that sort of thinking, and yes, a national inquiry is absolutely what's needed. So I am glad that one has been announced, but like most things with this Labour government, it's important to get into the details.
So I've arrived at a point, based on what I know to do with the whole of the audit, not just those two things I've mentioned to you, but more generally, that we've really got to grip this. And part of gripping it is obviously going for a national criminal investigation, but we also need to look at accountability locally, and we can't just let that happen in 1,000 different ways. The government has to grip that, and the way you can do that is in a sort of as innovative way as we can, using the statutory powers to do this. And it doesn't have to take lots of money in 7 years. I think there are different ways that we could do it.
Yeah, this was definitely some of the criticism for doing a national inquiry, one that I can understand, that it basically costs a lot, takes years, and then nothing actually gets implemented. And I do mean that last bit. I am going to get into it specifically when we come to the Tory section, but that J report, none of the recommendations were actually put in until Labour came in. And I do mean that. So you end up spending billions on this inquiry that finds a hell of a lot of awful, heinous crimes, and then the government just didn't act on it. So making the whole thing a waste of time. But Casey obviously came to the conclusion that, well, these local authorities are going to block what they can when it comes to these local inquiries, so statutory power from up on high. Also, she does mention there, it should actually investigate the higher levels of government as well, not just local authorities, but national authorities. So bear that in mind too as we move on through this video. So Starmer has had his best U-turn yet, by actually saying that he is going to hold a national inquiry into the grooming gangs, in a dramatic shift to his position after months of resilience. The Prime Minister said on Saturday that he had been convinced a full statutory inquiry was the right thing to do after a review by Baroness Casey of Blackstock. The findings of the recommendation of her review, which were commissioned by the Home Office in January, will be set out by Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, in Parliament on Monday. Casey is expected to explicitly link the grooming gang issue of men to Pakistani origin and say that white British girls who were targeted were institutionally ignored for fear of racism, and yes, that is pretty much what it said, but again, that's for a different video. Anyway, this was all happening while Starmer was in Canada for the G7 summit, and this U-turn, well, it opened the door to some quite obvious questions, such as, Mr. Starmer, why did you say this 5 months ago to then change your mind and join the bandwagon?
Calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics.
Yeah, according to Starmer, wanting a national inquiry is jumping on a far-right bandwagon. So here's Christopher Hope of GB News asking him, why did you say that?
When you said to me in January in that hospital, you said that it's a far-right bandwagon if you're calling for national inquiry. I know you're talking about politicians.
Was he? I don't think he was. I've just played the clip. He didn't differentiate. Just, you call for a national inquiry, you're on the far-right bandwagon. And even if he was, I don't think that makes it any better.
But a lot of GB News viewers and listeners were also concerned, and they felt you were calling them far-right. Would you perhaps regret that remark?
Well, I wasn't calling them far right. Now, Chris, right. I think you may have been in the room, and
yes, I was there.
You will have known. I said expressly politicians, and I mean politicians, and I was expressly calling out politicians, Jess Phillips in particular, because those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case.
I'd like to point out, so far, he's not saying politicians, he's saying people. And I'm going to be honest with you, this was January, this was before the whole Rupert Lowe situation, where he was a lot more open about his support for Mr. Robinson. What politician in January was supporting Tommy Robinson? The only people who would do that are Reform, and they are very clear that they want to put a bit of a wedge between them and Tommy Robinson, because frankly, he's not good for politics.
These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career?
No, not really. I've done an entire video on this. Jess Phillips is the type to, again, partake in the denial of the, well, ethnic aspect of these grooming gangs by effectively saying, oh, it's just men. She did it, by the way, when she was directly being attacked by, yet again, I suppose it was Muslim men in Birmingham. Not entirely sure what ethnic origin they actually had. Doesn't really matter. Because all she did was say, oh, it was men attacking me. It's men. It's men. Men, men, men. Not really going into more specifics of the things that matter, such as their ethnicity. Because it wasn't white men attacking her and slashing her helpers' tyres, was it? And also during the Summer of Love, with the Southport riots and things like that, absolutely nothing said about the Sky News woman who was intimidated by a couple of, again, ethnic minorities who were masked up on mopeds, intimidating her away from the area she was recording. Nothing about that. It's all the, albeit much larger, to be fair, but larger issues of the, well, riots that were going on that, well, were predominantly full of white people, with some attempts to burn hotels. So I have a little sympathy for that, but let's be absolutely real. Any sort of ethnic minority doing any sort of crime, Jess Phillips will bend over backwards to either deny it, ignore it, or obfuscate. Anyway, we will be coming back to Jess Phillips, but for now, you get the idea with that clip. It wasn't just politicians, it was pretty much everyone, including you and me.
It's not a far-right issue, is it?
No. And I was certainly wasn't criticising your view, isn't it? But I think if you look at what I said, and I know you have done carefully and you'll have listened to it, I'm very, very explicit, because there's one thing that I find frustrating. It's politicians who had the opportunity in power to do something about it and did absolutely nothing.
Is this the first time I've said this? Might be the first time I've said this. I actually agree with Starmer at the end there. Obviously, total lie about saying, oh, I wasn't calling your viewers far right. He was, no doubt about that. But I'm with him that, well, these politicians that were in power and did nothing about, say, the recommendations from the J report, yeah, we're going to have a whole section on that. Because if there's one thing I've kind of had a whole about turn on from the last few years of, well, running this channel and thinking about politics, effectively, I am at the point of, well, Tory party to lend a rest. 0 seats right now, probably a good idea. Anyway, from the Prime Minister, we'll move on to the next party leader that I have least of an issue with, which is Nigel Farage. He sent out his announcement, as usual, on social media in video form, so let's see what he has to say.
Well, maybe at last we're getting somewhere on the rape gangs, these horrendous multiple rapes by thousands of men of Pakistani origin, of predominantly white young British girls.
Yeah, that's just accurate, and that's pretty much been known as an open secret for probably at least 10 years. In fact, no longer than that. I think 2011 was when it became mainstreamed in the Times, thanks to Andrew Norfolk, and of course you had the BNP talking about this in their early days. And it was an open secret even before that. It was hard not to notice for people within these communities, but obviously they're throwaway northern towns. Who cares? The media and political elite could keep their head in the sand up until now, it turns out.
I first gave that sentence out in about 2014 to be condemned for daring to talk about this. But what's become clearer and clearer over the years is a massive cover-up. Social services, police, politicians, nobody wanted to talk about this for fear of being seen to be racist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not being funny. A lot of this will just be reiterating the same old talking points that a lot of us have been talking about for some time. Hell, I remember my first video on the grooming gangs was 7 or 8 years ago now. It's actually one of those videos that's just burned into my brain. All I did was read a long-form BBC report on, I think it was a witness statement from a grooming gang victim, and that was a struggle to get through. And the amount of people that won't even have read a quarter of that, or won't even know that article exists, is, well, a large reason we are in this mess. They'd rather deny and stick their head in the sand. Well, they don't have a choice anymore, largely thanks to a lot of people, but this particular week it's Baroness Casey.
Now, since we've been in Parliament, once again pushing for a full inquiry, and it has to have judicial powers, otherwise you can't call people in and hold them to account.
Yeah, this is a defence of why they said they'd do their own inquiry and then gave up on it. It's because it basically will get nowhere. This is also going to be the issue with Rupert Lowe's one, which, okay, he's doing something absolutely fine, but it won't get too far, and the information he has will either already be public record or quite easy to get anyway, because the stuff we actually really need, the stuff that you actually have to force people into the witness stand and testify for, no way he's getting that. And so it's good that instead we've got statutory powers into this national inquiry. But, well, that's the thing. Is it really a national inquiry?
So you might think that Keir Starmer doing a U-turn, and boy, he said people that supported the inquiry were getting on a far-right bandwagon. But there's no U-turn this Prime Minister is not capable of. So you might think it's good news that he's announced this inquiry.
I mean, to be fair, it is good news. It's just not the best news. And, well, Mr. Farage goes into why.
Well, there's a couple of things to point out. The first is Baroness Casey, who produced this report, which has finally pressured him into saying something. She makes it clear that a large number of these cases are committed not just by foreign-born nationals, but by asylum seekers. That means, yes, those young men that I've been talking about for the last 5 years, crossing the English Channel, undocumented, and often coming from cultures in which women aren't even second-class citizens. That's the first big point that I draw out from this.
And again, I'll be going into the details of that, but it is very good to make the point that, yes, all these asylum seekers that we are paying to live in hotels, and soon that the government is buying the hotels to try and hide the hotel statistics, are, actually involved in this massive, heinous crime. And not only that, by the way, Farage there really should have pointed out, well, clearly then this is still going on, because clearly we're still getting illegal immigrants over. That was a massive issue when it came to the boats over the past 5 years. Obviously, it was lorries before that. And there's no guarantee that this issue has, well, been resolved in any way. Hence, we're doing another inquiry. But to be honest with you, okay, inquiry good. Hopefully it doesn't take 7 years. And as Baroness Casey says, it is actually possible to do it much quicker and cheaper than the last one. But people really are at a point, especially, I know I am, we're at a point where we want to see heads roll, obviously not literally, or at least in my case not literally, but people actually punished for covering this up. People punished for being involved with this absolutely horrific level of cover-up, which, if Tony Blair is to be believed, was a result of trying to rub people like you and me's faces in diversity. So yes, we have to hope that this isn't just another delaying tactic, but even if it is, I can't see in 4 years, when Labour are out, and they are pretty much guaranteed to be out, that there will be anything other than a reckoning.
But the second point is read into the detail. See it here on this screen. This is not the full national inquiry the Prime Minister wants you to think it is. It's going to have detailed looks at specific areas as defined by the inquiry itself.
Yeah, Whitehall won't be investigated. Police chiefs, not investigated. What it's looking at is local authorities. It's a coordinated local inquiry that they are spinning as a national inquiry, which is why the pressure still needs to be kept up. You know, Rupert Lowe doing his own inquiry, I mean, as mentioned, it probably won't get too far with actually finding anything particularly damning, because, well, they can't really actually get any witnesses who don't want to be witnesses anyway. In other words, they'll probably find a whole bunch of victims that they can get witness statements from. That's good. Actually, that's good, that's fine. It's not a total waste of time. But when it comes to people who are actually in power, people who were within the council, the local authority, the police stations, no chance. It's not happening, which is why this particular inquiry that Casey has recommended also isn't a total waste of time. However, it's nowhere near what will actually be needed to see full justice for all of these poor girls that were raped and abused and groomed by these disgusting men. And women, actually. There were women involved in these gangs as well, who were effectively used to manipulate the women into, or the girls, sorry, I should say, into thinking they're in a secure and safe place. They're just as culpable.
Which means there could be cases of mass abuse that don't even get discussed. We don't yet know who the judge is. We're told it could last for 3 years. And my fear is this stain on our country, and believe you me, the rest of the world looks at this, honestly, with incredulity. My American friends can't believe this sort of stuff could have happened in the United Kingdom. My fear is that he tries to tell you, Starmer, that he's going to deal with the problem, and actually what they might once again do is kick this into the long grass.
Yeah, and that's definitely a worry for me. And I am very critical of this government for announcing a national inquiry that is actually just a coordinated local inquiry. That's all it is. So it's definitely a win, but it's not total victory or anything like that. It is, at the very least, a sign that the pressure is getting to Starmer and his government, which is also very good. Anyway, next up we move over to the Tories, and specifically we go to Kemi Badenoch's announcement here.
In the last 48 hours, we have heard a lot about the rape gang scandal and about a national inquiry. And what I want to do this morning is bring some light where there's been a lot of heat. What we haven't heard very much of is the survivors' views. Survivors and their families have gone through hell to get here.
Yeah, I mean, okay, fair enough. I would imagine the Casey report has an awful lot of summarised views of an awful lot of the survivors' views, but Tories are here with survivors to give their statement on it. Perfectly fine with me.
And I think that they've been ignored for far too long.
Yeah, this probably isn't the type of thing I'd be saying if I was just in government for 14 years. I'm gonna be honest with you. And this is why I'm very sympathetic to the whole Tory party, the lend arrest view of the whole thing. It takes... There's a lot of people who have brass necks at the moment. Pretty much everyone who was part of the last Tory government, I definitely put in that category. Probably not as far as Keir Starmer, to be fair to them, but are you going to put your trust in people who ignored this problem for 14 years? I certainly wouldn't.
And I'll start by saying how much we welcome Baroness Casey's report and the recommendation for a national inquiry. This is something that we've been very vocal on in the House of Commons, and we're really glad that we finally got to this place. And I think it's important to reiterate why we want national inquiry. It's not just because we believe this is still ongoing. It is because so much activity has taken place. 2014, 2015, 2018, local inquiries and investigations launched by the Home Office, independent reports, independent inquiries, a gangs task force as recently as 2023, finding about 807.
Yeah, I will point out at this point, I'll go into detail after I go through a couple of other statements from Tories, but these were not main recommendations that came out of things like the J report. It needs to be pointed out, Tories did the bare minimum on this. And coming out trying to pretend that this issue is a uniquely Labour one, it's a very risky and bold strategy that I don't think is going to pay off. So let's just quickly go into a Sky News clip with Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, who at this point I want to point out was Minister of State for Crime, Policing and Fire from October 2022 to July 2024, for 2 years. When the J report came out as well, he was the Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire. Just bear that in mind as we go forward.
We've been calling on this for about 6 months, and Keir Starmer has at last agreed, but he had to be dragged here kicking and screaming. He's not doing this because he wants to or because he believes in it. He's doing this because he was forced to.
Okay, interesting. Why have you only been calling for a national inquiry for 6 months? There have been people asking for national inquiries for years. Maggie Oliver's been calling for it for absolutely ages. If not an inquiry, then further action on the damn thing. At least put in the recommendations from the J report, but they didn't do that. So to say that Starmer's been dragged kicking and screaming here is just, again, a bold strategy when the Tories were dragged kicking and screaming and did the bare minimum.
Forced partly by the Casey report and partly by the vote that we have scheduled in Parliament on Wednesday. When this first came out, the need for a national inquiry into the cover-up in January, Keir Starmer smeared people like me and other campaigners. He claimed we were part of a far-right bandwagon.
I mean, yes, Keir Starmer was very stupid, but again, I can't help but notice, I did a quick Google search for Chris Philp on grooming gangs during his time as Minister for Policing and Crime and what have you, and, well, there's nothing. Oh, tackle knife crime by increasing stop and search. Okay, I agree with that, totally fine. He confused Rwanda and the Congo. Okay, I don't really care. It's a point that I really do have to keep bringing up. Tories were trying, or not at the very least, if they weren't helping suppress the story, some of them were just oblivious to the whole thing, and as far as I'm concerned, are culpable as well. As Nigel Farage said, he was talking about it since 2014, okay? That was after Andrew Norfolk's Times article, but still it's at least 10 years of talking about the damn thing. It's hard to see this as anything other than political expediency from the Tories, and the thing I find strangest about all this is that they're acting like they weren't just in power for 14 years. And again, just to go on top of this, okay, he wasn't Home Secretary, however, he was Minister for Crime and Policing. Let's quickly go through what some of the J Report recommendations were. So the first recommendation here is statutory requirement of mandatory reporting. Again, I want to remind you, this report was published just before Chris Phillips became Minister for Crime and Policing. And mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse in professions would definitely come under that ministry, if not the Home Office in general. Anyway, when was this recommendation implemented? January 24, 2025, under the Labour government. Tories sat on it for 2 years, Labour implemented it. I am talking about the grooming gangs and saying that Labour did better than Tories on certain parts of it. Yeah, I'm definitely in the mindset of Tory party de lend arrest. Second recommendation is the establishment of a national redress scheme for England and Wales to provide some monetary redress for child sexual abuse for those who have been let down by institutions in the past. In other words, it's a reparation scheme for the girls and women who have been let down in the past by, well, politicians, police, social workers, for covering up their crimes and not helping them seek justice. Well, this is something that the Tories actually tried to do something about at least. Child sexual abuse redress scheme to be established. The government has committed to a redress scheme for the victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. That was back in 2023. Has everything come of this? Has anything come of this? Has there been any redress scheme that is actually implemented? No. I can't find anything, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, but from what I can tell, this is literally the only thing the government has ever announced on the redress scheme. We intend to establish one. And then the Tories got out, and I've not seen anything from Labour to actually set this up since. So far from the Tory side on all this, sorry to break bad news, but I've just double-checked this. Child sexual abuse victims denied justice after compensation scheme scrapped over cost back in May. The governments in Scotland and Northern Ireland have set up compensation schemes and paid hundreds of millions of pounds to victims of child sexual abuse, but ministers admit that a similar programme for the rest of the UK has been shelved. They promised it and this Labour government have scrapped it because they have no money. This is unbelievable. The best the Tories have done is promise one part so far of the three main recommendations, and then Labour come in, they actually deliver the first one and have scrapped the second. They are all useless. Uniparty de lend arrest. Anyway, since we're on a roll, the third recommendation is intended to secure the long-term spotlight on child sexual abuse through the creation of a Child Protection Authority in England and Wales. The CPAs will have the powers to inspect any institution associated with children, and it will not replace current inspectorates in relation to statutory authorities, but may require inspection of those authorities by existing inspectorates. In other words, have a whole institution specifically for inspecting child sexual abuse cases where institutions are involved. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly fine. This was implemented by Jess Phillips of all people in April. Again, this was something that the Tories just sat on and did nothing about. Say what you will about Labour, and how they have been absolutely useless in this, and historically have absolutely dropped the ball when it comes to the grooming gangs and the institutional cover-up, but when it comes to the last year or 3 years, they've actually done more in power on this subject than the Tories have, which is pretty incredible to say. So yeah, all of this, going on to the interviews, having a go at Labour about this, it falls on deaf ears for me. You have been probably not as culpable when it comes to, say, councils covering this up and whatever, but when it comes to parliamentary powers on this, you did nothing. Absolutely nothing, despite the fact this was all recommended in a report. You had, let's say, institutional permission to do all these, and none of them are particularly offensive, and you did nothing. And what have Labour done? They implemented 2 of them and scrapped the other one that you weren't implementing anyway. So yeah, I am fully in the mindset that the Tory party is over and nobody should be supporting it, based on not only this issue, but many, many others. They need to die. They are institutionally crippled and corrupt. I cannot see any way to reform them, even if they have Robert Jenrick as leader. Anyway, pivoting back round to Kemi Badenoch, according to the news agents, she sent out an email saying, "We won." And Baroness Casey was actually asked what her thoughts were on that response.
Kemi Badenoch sent a email to all Conservative supporters saying, "We won. We won!" ! Grooming gang inquiry announced. Now, given what you've said about politicisation...
Yes, that is a very bad reaction to get from someone who is largely trying to keep politics out of this. And again, it's one of those things of what really caused Starmer to U-turn. Reality of the situation is that the only person who managed to get this U-turn out of him was Baroness Casey, by virtue of being an expert who looked at all the evidence, published it, and everyone frankly seems quite happy with it. And effectively it gave Starmer permission, and he probably got permission directly from someone at a dinner party, to go through with the national inquiry now. And again, I can't help but say it. Brass neck on these people. As we went through, nothing, and I mean nothing from the J report, none of the major 3 points recommendations anyway, were implemented by the Tories, despite the fact they had 2 years to implement it. And 2 of them have been implemented by Labour within their first year, and the third one was scrapped due to cost, which genuinely isn't the worst reason to do it, but it's still incredibly disappointing. Based on this fact alone, I actually expect Labour to do more with this Casey report than I would have expected the Tories to do. I mean that unironically, and that is an incredible thing to say, really. I couldn't imagine myself ever saying that, but having looked at all the evidence and looked at the recent history, I actually do have more reason to trust Labour is going to actually do something about these recommendations than the Tories are. I don't even think it's malicious from the Tories. I think they are just that useless.
Do you think it's in good taste?
I wish that it was a different response to it.
She does kind of defend it in another clip, saying, "Well, that's politics, isn't it?" Which I do understand, and I'm not going to have too much of a go at Kemi Badenoch for that. However, I have much more of an issue with the fact she is saying we won while pretending that they weren't in power a year ago, literally a year ago. And another slight defence of Badenoch, she was mainly in the Treasury as either Secretary for State for Business and Trade, or she was President of the Board of Trade. She was also Minister for Women and Equalities, but that post doesn't really seem to give you much power, so again, I can't really blame her too much for that. But given there have been people demanding action on this for years while the Tories have been in charge, and then say we won after another national inquiry that isn't really a national inquiry is announced. Yeah, pretty poor politics in the long run, I'd argue. But I know of basically nobody who defends Kemi Badenoch, so that's probably not that surprising. Anyway, I'll touch upon a couple of decent reactions to this from people that I frankly respect on this subject. Maggie Oliver, who runs a largely apolitical foundation that pushes absolutely massively for justice in this grooming gang scandal, tweeted out that I have had 2 private meetings with Baroness Casey in the past 3 months, and at her request I've also taken a group of 10 survivors to meet her and share their horrific experiences with her. She called me yesterday to update me, and for that I am very grateful. She is one of the very few people at the top who has given me any reason to trust them, and although I doubt the review will deliver everything I'd hope for, I honestly believe it will be brutal in its exposure of the criminal negligence by those at the top that I've been shouting about for 13 years. Maggie Oliver's definitely the type of person to watch and follow for this sort of thing. She's massively apolitical, won't join any party, won't join any politician's push that's explicitly political for things like this. She really is the best person to follow for the best commentary and best work that you can find on these issues. And I'm very glad to see that the Casey review incorporated part of her work. It's very good to see and makes me want to trust the Casey review. Hence, I'm going to go through it tomorrow. So Maggie Oliver's been doing some media rounds with some of the survivors who met with Casey, and there's lots to say, as you'd imagine, but both her and thousands of survivors whose lives have been destroyed by this gross criminal neglect, have waited many years for this day, and so we can wait until tomorrow to say more. So it clearly is good to have this sort of inquiry, but as Maggie said, it won't be covering everything she wants, and to be honest with you, it's been mentioned by other people. This Casey review, it's really not had any findings that are surprising to anyone, well, in my sphere and the other online spheres, and not even necessarily online, just spheres that do not trust the mainstream media. It's stuff we already know. It's predominantly Pakistani men. There was an ethnic line to it all. It was covered up by plenty of people. Taxi firms were involved, for God's sake. But what the massive thing it has done, quite clearly, is given permission for the entire uniparty class and even the lefty media class to effectively cede ground on all this. And that is the thing we're going to be going through in a second. But first I want to go through Dominic Cummings' comments, where he makes the point that while all of this grooming gang stuff is going on, for no coincidence whatsoever, and it's been kept quiet by Whitehall, using obviously this big news as the cover, the repulsive Dominic Greaves group working for Number 10 on a plan to create a legal definition for Islamophobia put out this call for evidence. Dominic Greaves, by the way, Tory politician. Remember when Andrew Norfolk was labelled Islamophobic for his reporting of the grooming gangs? Nota bene, pretty much all of SW1 stays Islamophobic under the APPG definition, accepted by the Labour Party and two-tier Starmer. Will Labour be changing its own rules? And yeah, this is what I keep saying. Uniparty, complete idiots, full of absolutely insane people that think they're doing the right thing. They overwhelmingly voted in favour of decriminalising abortion up till birth. Again, that is too far for most people, even though feminism has pretty much taken over. Even the MPs go too far for your average feminist. I'm not even joking. Anyway, back to the media elite, and this was some Sky News journalists on a podcast just trying to make sense of the whole damn thing. Why does everyone all of a sudden care about grooming gangs?
I mean, Mark, you couldn't make it up, could you? It really is so bizarre and convoluted. So one of the real big moments, the big moment under this government of political pressure was when Elon Musk, I mean, how he knew about this, who knows?
What do you mean, who knows? We know exactly how he knows. It was posted all over Twitter about the Oxford court transcript where they were describing absolutely heinous, detailed crimes that were being committed against girls. I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but foreign objects being inserted and branding being taken place on the girls was happening. It was all over Twitter. It's very simple. Elon Musk was on his own platform looking at this and quite rightly found it absolutely horrific. And then it's not hard to find out that this was all covered up. But this is the thing with SW1 and the media class. They stuck their heads so far in the sand that they find it incredible anyone can know about this, because it's been so hidden from them. Or if it's not hidden, it's usually dismissed as some sort of conspiracy theory. At least that was what was happening for 20 years or so.
Got involved in the grooming gang scandal. Very specifically, it was about a request in Oldham for another inquiry. Jess Phillips, the Home Office Minister, had said no, it wasn't necessary. Elon Musk criticised her on his social media platform, on X, and that opened the floodgates for a barrage of criticism from the US and, of course, domestically.
Yeah, people were not happy that quite clearly this was a problem that was still going on. We quite clearly don't know all the details about it, and so quite clearly there was a need for another inquiry. As it turns out in the long run, wow, all these far-right people were correct, and Jess Phillips once again is completely humiliated by her own decisions. Because every time it's what her brain does, all she can do is cope and seethe and try and dismiss all of this criticism. But Jess Phillips is for later in the video. We're finishing off on her, so look forward to that.
Now, the question at the time was, who is pulling the strings, if you like, behind Elon Musk? Because why would he know about this? Why would he be interested? And the answer came from lots of different places. Is it Dominic Cummings? The language he used, the issue at hand, the effect that it had on UK politics seemed to have someone like Dominic Cummings behind it. I asked Dominic Cummings, he said, absolutely not. It wasn't me. I have never spoken to Elon Musk, but I think there are still lots of raised eyebrows about that in Westminster.
Yes, because you are absolutely full of morons. You don't understand that emergent, organic phenomena can occur, and there is nothing quite as organic as people's absolute disgust at the thought of entire gangs with hundreds of people involved abusing and doing heinous crimes to young girls. Same thing happened with Epstein, by the way. Everyone found that despicable. Same thing with Harvey Weinstein. Open secret for ages, everyone hated it. You get justice in the end. This is probably going to be bigger than all that, because it's happened for longer and it's been covered up to a much greater extent. Maybe not the cover-up part for Epstein, but you never know. Two quite clearly clever people who are on the spectrum speak similarly. This is enough for these journalists to say that they must be hand in hand, because at the end of the day, that's all these journalists know. I am told what to report on and I report on it. Must be the same for Elon Musk. He's told what to say and must say it. total NPCs. They have no idea what independent thought looks like. Hence, the only thing they can think of is, oh, well, Dominic Cummings is clearly at the top of the hierarchy for all this. It's insane. We are run by insane politicians and have insane people in the media who push these same insane narratives on us. And this grooming gang inquiry is breaking them apart at the seams. Anyway, former Chief Prosecutor of the North West, Nazir Afzal, said, "Fact, my team and I successfully prosecuted thousands of child sexual abusers for 5 years. I was managed by Keir Starmer." Obviously in reply to the Conservatives saying Starmer did nothing. "We listened, we helped change the way every agency responded to the threat, and ethnicity was an issue, class was an issue, and the Tory government took away much of the funding." That last part's probably true to some extent. Everything got defunded to fund the NHS. As for how effective the Crown Prosecution Service actually was in this instance, probably not very good, but I'll need to read the details of the report tomorrow. Anyway, unfortunately, when it comes to posting on Twitter, people do tend to look at your history, and the Huddersfield Preservation Society account had a few examples of him saying, oh, well, actually, the sex offenders are mostly white British. This was, by the way, again in the report, part of the denial part of the report, and it basically wasn't true and total nonsense from the Home Office, under Priti Patel, by the way. There's other instances of saying that ethnicity is not the issue. There's other evidence of him saying the mostly white people statistic yet again. Just constant nonsense like that, but now the cat's out of the bag, he can't say that anymore, and so he doesn't. While trying to pretend that he didn't just spend years, again, trying to deny, cover this up, obfuscate, and all that other nonsense. Crown Prosecutor, by the way, Chief Crown Prosecutor, by the way, during this whole thing, he has to make sure that he is as far away from this scandal as possible because, to some extent, he's probably involved. In fact, we can clearly tell he's involved in the denial. Whether he was doing that intentionally or not, I don't really care. This is the type of thing that people want investigated and to see these people in court because of the failure and criminal neglect that has occurred and caused thousands of girls to not be able to see justice and to have the worst crimes imaginable committed against them. Anyway, speaking of historic tweets, Peter Walker, who is political editor of The Guardian 2 years ago now, obviously reported that there were 60 plus organisations and experts, including the NSPCC, who warned that inaccurate and divisive claims about child sexual abuse and grooming gangs undermined tackling the crime and almost certainly made children less safe. And obviously this was about Suella Braverman saying, well, ethnicity and Pakistani men are largely the groups that are involved in these crimes and has been covered up. It turns out, in the end, thanks to the Casey report, these people have been proven wrong after 2 years. I think it's high time I also let you all know, your tax money probably went to pretty much all these organisations because they're all charities, and charities always get, well, not always, but an awful lot of the big ones get public funding. And I've said this for quite some time, I don't give to charity. I do. I only give to local charity, though, because these charities are just glorified lobbying firms. That's all they are, and I refuse to give my money to them, especially if their lobbying is involved in, again, helping cover up this heinous crime. I don't want any of my public money going toward them, and frankly, I think this is something that Reform should focus on. If they get in, they should make a promise or a policy that they are going to stop all public funding of charities. Stop it all, and also redefine what it means to be a charitable cause. Being a lobbying group should not give you charitable status. That is ridiculous. And I wouldn't be shocked if that's something that Tony Blair got in. But who knows, I'm not checking that now. Anyway, I decided to check over on Peter Walker on Blue Sky. He really didn't have much to say on this other than to reply to just news of the day. 2 likes here just to say that Starmer refuses to rule out defending Israel. And then, oh, by the way, also there's a national grooming inquiry going on. When he reports that there are 60 plus charities saying that, oh, it's not Pakistani men, you know, a bit of a Twitter thread, big news everyone should see. Oh, we have a national grooming inquiry now and it disproves that? Just a footnote. You do not hate journalists enough. I guarantee. Anyway, Peter Jukes, who set up the Byline Times, who take on Otto English as a author for some reason, and a journalist, sorry. What was his retort to all this? Oh, notice how nobody talks about Christian grooming gangs when discussing the long history of child sexual abuse in care homes, sports clubs. Funny that. Yeah, that's been dealt with. and that nearly killed the Catholic Church. It didn't nearly kill it, but it certainly did massive damage to it. There is no doubt about that. You know, people were complaining about that as far back as I can remember. I don't know what the hell he's talking about. The difference here with the Muslim grooming gangs one is that it is still being covered up, and we are not seeing the large amount of court cases you would expect from a situation like that. That is why nobody is talking about that, because largely the issue is dealt with. But the person with the even bigger brass neck in all this, probably the largest one actually, was Nick Lowles. Actually, maybe it was Storm with the biggest, but it's certainly a competition, who said, the decision by the government to initiate an inquiry about on-street grooming by gangs is the right one and should have been taken years ago. For those who don't know, I really should have introduced this. This is the guy who is head of Hope Not Hate. The people who were calling plenty of perfectly normal as well as genuine wrong-uns far right for all thinking that grooming gangs are a bad thing and there should be an inquiry into it. In fact, it says at the bottom, in 2023, Nick Lowes said Home Secretary Suella Braverman, by singling out British Pakistani men when child sexual abuse is not confined to a specific ethnic group, irresponsibly stirs up hate. Nick is responsible for those speaking about grooming gangs being called racist. Yeah. This is why he has such a brass neck, and it actually takes some level of ridiculous cognitive dissonance to write this out and send it after he has spent years and years and years smearing plenty of people who did not deserve to be smeared for effectively noticing a rather large issue going on in the UK at the moment. For too long, the victims have been ignored, not believed, and let down by the system and people who are meant to protect them. Yes, you are part of that system. They need justice to be heard. Hope Not Hate get public funding, by the way. This was publicly funded to help effectively keep the party line on grooming gangs in place. He was a stooge. He was a pawn in the whole game, and now he's pretending he isn't because the party line had to change because there's not much more they can do about it. Cat's out the bag. Thank you, Baroness Casey. More importantly, we need to ensure that more young people are now caught up in this type of abuse in future. I don't know. I don't think he meant caught up in this type of abuse. I think he means more young people are now saved from this type of abuse in future. That's a weird sentence. Child sexual exploitation comes in many different forms and all need to be investigated and stopped. Yes, fine. Too many girls and women have been abused by grooming gangs in towns and cities across the country and it has to stop. It's time for once to put the victims first. Yes, it is, but you were on the side of the perpetrators for far too long. It's amazing you wrote this. This has completely broken the old establishment line on all this. It's completely broken it. They have no other choice but to effectively pretend that they were always in the mindset that, say, Tommy Robinson or the early BNP were right. And I, for one, don't particularly want them to forget that they played a massive part in covering all this up. You are not going to be forgotten in all this, and if I had my way, you would absolutely be facing court. Anyway, back to Parliament quickly. Here is Sean Davies, Labour MP for Telford, talking about how in the past Amber Rudd and Rishi Sunak apparently refused to provide a statutory inquiry into the grooming gangs in Telford.
Did a local-based review was because the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd and the then local government Minister Rishi Sunak refused to provide a statutory inquiry into Telford.
Anyway, here's a letter from back in 2016 that, as you can see in paragraphs 5 and 6, we would like to take the opportunity to reaffirm that Telford and Wrekin Council and West Mercia Police are transparent organisations. The Telford and Wrekin Safeguarding Children Board operates in a very open way. We welcome explanations of the effectiveness of our services and remain absolutely committed to tackling the issue, working alongside the national and local partners. And they've had 3 inquiries onto the issue in 2016 and understand the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse chaired by Professor Alexis Jay will assess the extent to which we have learned lessons, implemented recommendations and put in place effective strategies to prevent child sexual exploitation in future. Yes, that is the J report, by the way. I need to remind everyone, it took 7 years. Anyway, in the next page of the letter, just over halfway down, given the recent findings of Ofsted and the fact that the government's own independent inquiry chaired by Alexis Jay is already committed to looking at what happened in Telford, we do not feel it is time that a further inquiry is necessary. In other words, this inquiry that Sean Davies is talking about, it was rejected by the Telford Labour Council. Let's have a look at who signed this letter. Oh, look at that, second signature down on the left. Councillor Sean Davies. That is the same Sean Davies who became Labour MP for Telford, who has effectively tried to blame Amber Rudd and Rishi Sunak for not doing an inquiry into Telford, despite the fact that they were planning to, and it was Telford councillors who all signed a letter saying, no, please don't do it, we've already got the national one going on. So to try and now turn this around and blame the Tories for it, absolutely ridiculous. Tories have a lot to answer for when it comes to this case and this national disgrace, but let's not pretend that they are the ones mainly to blame here. Tories are completely useless. Labour had an awful lot of people within their ranks who were nefarious and actively tried to hide this. Never forget. Anyway, Guido Fawkes, as ever with this political drama, was on the ball when it came to pointing out all the Labour MPs who effectively called people far right for demanding an inquiry, or talking about the grooming gangs. You can read them at your own leisure, but it includes Keir Starmer a few times, David Lammy of course, Yvette Cooper, Lucy Powell of course with the old dog whistle when Tim Montgomery brought up the grooming gangs, Lisa Nandy's another one, Bridget Phillipson. A lot of these people who are high up in the Labour Party and in the cabinet. But the main one we're going through now is Jess Phillips, who back in January said, I don't need to wait for a national inquiry to tell me there are people who should have lost their jobs, people who should probably go to prison. Who has obviously 180'd on this whole thing. So here's a Sky News clip from Monday.
Some people think that all people of Pakistani origin are abusers, and some people think that none of them are. Thinking has got us nowhere. What Baroness Kate, what the ICSA recommendation was that we needed better ethnicity data. We still don't have it.
Yeah, pretty much everyone in Parliament and the media still tried to imply it was racist for some time. But I would say, if you're only listening to this, it should be pointed out that Jess Phillips for some time has just looked gaunt, as has most of the Labour front bench, because I can't imagine being in power is actually that easy. But Jess Phillips especially has been kind of hidden from the public eye for a few months, and it's pretty obvious that it's because she was definitely at the centre of Elon Musk's whole tirade, justified tirade by the way, against the grooming gang and the cover-up, and Jess Phillips has been one of the biggest apologists for it, and so she's being wheeled out again now because, well, none of them can avoid this absolutely massive newsworthy U-turn.
What Baroness Casey has recommended, which we will undertake, is the mandatory recording of ethnicity of perpetrators of child sexual abuse. What she has looked at, admittedly, just in 3 police force areas in the review, found an overrepresentation of Asian or British Pakistani origin males. It doesn't matter how I feel about that. Those are the facts.
Yeah, it's quite funny. This is the first time I've ever seen her bring that up and actually try to address it. Again, I've covered it in other videos, but at her acceptance speech when she won Birmingham Yardley last year, there was a whole bunch of, well, certainly Muslim men. I'm not sure if they were all Pakistani necessarily, but they were chanting, trying to intimidate her, and they eventually had to get kicked out. She never addresses their ethnicity. It's always just, oh, it was a load of men. And now here she is having no choice but to try and address it. And again, it's always with the tagline of, oh, I'm not racist, and really laying that on thick. I don't really mind people saying I'm not racist, but when you're laying it on this thick, it's clear that you care much more about how you are seen by the ivory tower class than actually caring about these kids.
And if we ignore that, how can we ever come up with solutions?
Oh, good question, Jess. Why were you ignoring it for years then, if that's your approach? Again, brass neck, cowardly, total U-turn because there's no other choice. We're at a breaking point with this parliament and the way the whole of British society has been working for the past, not even just 30 years, probably the past century. Thatcher was absolutely railed against for years by the media class and the ivory tower class, to eventually get kicked out by the Wets and install John Major. We're at a point where all of these institutions and these power dynamics are probably to some extent going to be completely realigned, and everyone is talking about that in the media class at the moment. It's actually much more fascinating to listen to the people on Times Radio and things like that, who are in real time having to completely change their minds on all of this, well, common knowledge that they used to have.
It feels like at the heart of this is misogyny.
Of course, they're all men, aren't they? That's the other characteristic that all of these abusers have.
Yeah, this is Jess Phillips' get out of jail free card, and I'm very fed up of having to listen to it, but we're going to anyway.
And this belief that the girls were, the children, were worthless.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I think that sometimes in the debate about the ethnicity, which, you know, it has been, you know, that's not new news. This has been written in many reviews over the years. It's just nothing has ever been done about it to improve the data. We will do that. But what often gets lost for me is actually the way we dismiss women's, and especially young girls' voices. Treat them as if they're criminals, treat them as if they're, you know, sluts and hussies, and they were asking for it.
Oh, I just let that play out. I didn't really know what I could say to that. What commentary would be added there. This is just nonsense. They're all men. Oh, yes, we can get on top of that. Oh, it's because they were women they were worthless. No, they were quite clear. It's been in court documents. It's been reported on plenty. They were pretty clear that it's because they were Muslim, it's because they were white girls, that they were seen as sluts, as Jess Phillips mentioned, but she's trying to put it much more in it's a patriarchy thing, just general men versus women class struggle, rather than what it actually was, which was, well, these Pakistani Muslim men, to an extent, following some radical in-group preference, where they just completely dehumanise the out-group. Details and reasoning for that I think are still under investigation, but there's no doubt in my mind that certain fundamentalist teachings in, say, the Muslim world are definitely at part to play here. But no, according to Jess Phillips, it's just third-wave feminism thinking, just absolute no thought behind the eyes of Jess Phillips. But anyway, here she is on Newsnight.
So when Baroness Casey says today it is not racist to want to examine the ethnicity of offenders,
of course not.
You say absolutely right.
Of course not. Okay. I didn't think it was in forced marriage. I didn't think in moving forward on forced marriage. I didn't think it was racist in moving forward on female genital mutilation. I didn't think it was racist.
So sorry, when people say you and others in Labour, in the Labour Party, in opposition and in government, have stuck your head in the sand about this.
Well, I mean, that people can. There are undoubtedly people who have.
Jess Phillips again is trying to get on this point to effectively try and throw other people under the bus. I mean, as I mentioned before, link in the description to my video on Jess Phillips sticking her head in the sand when it has come to, well, ethnic tensions in the UK and how she largely ignores them. She's been a literal victim of it and still ignored it, by the way. So she is prime suspect for this accusation.
Maggie Oliver is absolutely right. When Sarah Champion came out and spoke about it at the time, I completely and utterly supported her. So yeah, look, people have turned a blind eye. There's I'm not denying that.
Including you?
Absolutely not me. I have never turned a blind eye. I never would shy away from calling a problem what it is.
Again, just go check out my video. There's just evidence upon evidence that this is simply not true. But then she's also asked in the Newsnight interview about effectively why she became the centre of attention when it came to the grooming gangs.
You mentioned the Prime Minister. You will remember that he described the calls back in January for a national inquiry as people jumping on a bandwagon of the far right. When you reflect on that, was that wise?
Look, I think that what the Prime Minister was saying was this was in the wake of sort of Elon Musk furore, was that the Conservative politicians, Kemi Badenoch, the Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp, that he was saying they were jumping on the bandwagon of Elon Musk talking about on Twitter.
Yeah, this is just the Labour line at the moment. He wasn't clear. He was just talking about... it's interesting how it's only Tory MPs they're saying at the moment, because I think they know they can't really say it against reform. But it is funny that they're trying to retroactively change what Starmer said, when it's just not what he said at all. But she then goes into, bringing up another boogeyman for the Labour Party.
I think it was actually Liz Truss. She gets forgotten in this story. Liz Truss, who started it, and then Elon Musk carried it on, is that he was like, where have you been? You've just been in government. You were the policing minister and the children's minister. Where have you been? And frankly,
but was that a knee-jerk reaction simply because they are politicians on the right?
No, I think it's because they're politicians who had never cared and thought it was politically expedient.
Again, I'm not actually totally against Jess Phillips saying that. However, Jess Phillips is also one of the worst people in this entire story, so I have no sympathy. But bringing up Liz Truss, which is the main point of that clip, Liz Truss actually responded to this saying, I accused Jess Phillips of excusing masked Islamist thugs, which she did. She absolutely did, by the way, it's in my video, and rejecting Oldham's call for a government inquiry into the grooming gangs, which she did. This is also true. It was not a far-right bandwagon, it was about holding her to account for a complete dereliction of duty. Fair enough to Liz Truss. Because there's no doubt in my mind that it doesn't matter what the political realignment looks like, whether it's a completely reformed Tory party that I just can't see happening, or whether it's a reformed majority or minority government, doesn't really matter. You are definitely going to see massive court cases over this and heads rolling for it. This is possibly the worst crime that has ever happened on this soil. And it's certainly the worst crime that people have seen within our lifetimes. And all the people who have either been in power or opposition for the past few years are trying to do is completely obfuscate. And if they're not trying to obfuscate, they are trying to pretend that they were on board with this idea the whole time. We're certainly seeing this from Labour. Really, at the end of the day, I'm largely on Maggie Oliver's side in this interview.
But for me, I listened to a bit of that debate in the House of Commons.
It was absolutely
they
waste
are
of time.
like school children. Stop scoring party political points. This is children's lives.
Amen.
You know, Conservatives are equally negligent. Get together, resolve the problem. Don't be covering it up and corrupt. Get a grip and solve it. And
unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen, but at the end of the day, it's all you're really going to see from politicians. And yes, to an extent, I involve Reform in that as well. I will say on Reform's side, they don't exactly have skeletons in the closet on this issue, which is why I find it so much more disgusting and why I focus so much more on Labour and the Tories. But anyway, that's pretty much everything I wanted to go through today. Obviously, tomorrow I will have a much more detailed look at what's actually in the Casey review, because it was said over the weekend there's got to be something big in it. There has to be something big for this U-turn on the inquiry. And obviously the fact that there is actually some detail on the ethnic makeup of these gangs, and the fact that there's an entire section called Denial, yeah, we're definitely looking at it. Anyway, in the meantime, that is everything I had for you for today. So tomorrow it's Subnautica. Next Tuesday it is Tosh News, more Subnautica next Thursday, and Laughing at the Guardian next Saturday. Videos out, of course, as and when I can make them. Sorry I had to skip Monday and Tuesday, but I was very busy. And it would be on this week of all weeks where we've had massive bombshells like this dropping that I'd have to miss out on. But there we go, it's the way of the world sometimes. But we're back to regular scheduled programming. If you enjoy what I do, please do leave a like, leave a comment, and leave a subscribe to me. They really help me out in the algorithm. If you really enjoy what I do and have some spare money, you can always donate via becoming a member or via super chats or super thanks in any video or stream that I do. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.